I do feel that this is quite a difficult challenge here, because on this little networking discussion, I discovered that a lot of you will have heard Nick talking about AKU's story, and you will probably know a lot of what I'm going to be telling you, but I think it will actually be quite interesting to hear this from a different perspective. This is from the industry perspective as opposed to the patient organisation perspective. So the first thing I want to say really is that in all, this is a retrospective look back at a story which is continuing on to this day. But I think it's the compliance and rules and regulations have moved at a pace, and some of the things you hear maybe you may go, whoa, can we do this now? But we did it in good faith at the time. I think the other thing to really concentrate on is that this is a story. And in all stories you have a hero, and you have a villain, and you have helpers, and you have objectives and goals in mind. And as a general rule, pharmaceutical companies put themselves in the role of hero. In actual fact, if we believe in what we say, in almost every corporate objective we say the patient is at the centre of all we do, then the industry is no longer the hero. We're actually the helper, the facilitator. And I think as you see my story here, you'll see that SOBI was not really the hero. We were the helper and the facilitator to enable things to happen. So the story is actually, I'm going to tell you the complete story of the birth of the first orphan indication, and then move it through to the AKU story, which you may know more about. So many of you may not know that, as is often the case, we don't know where our drugs come from. But this actually is the story of a product that came through from the agrochemical industry, and came through from a company called Stakeholder Agrochemicals, and a class of chemicals that were discovered which were, I had to check the slides because I can never remember this class of, it's polyketide natural products, and it came from the bottle brush plant. So this is work going on in the mid to late 80s, and as part of that discovery work and libraries of chemicals that were put together, one of them was a compound called NTBC, and I am not going to try and cite the full name. It is far too complicated. It was a very effective product. And this is some of the data that was generated for this product in terms of its effectiveness as a weed killer. Very interesting. The really interesting part, though, came when they started doing some animal studies on this product, because that's part of the process that even herbicides had to go through. And in that work, they actually discovered corneal lesions in the rat model. What were they? The scientists looked into them, and they discovered that they were tyrosine. Interestingly, after 3 weeks of removal of NTBC from the treatment of rats, these crystals resolved. And it became just an interesting academic scientific piece of work that then moved forward because somebody made the link to a human disease called hereditary type 1 tyrosinemia. There then happened a whole cascade of events because they had to work through a whole series of regulatory discussions, internal politics, etc., etc. So ICI bought the company, the pharmaceutical MD had to be involved in it, and the scientists got in contact with a professor in Stockholm who was interested in this particular disease. Then they had to get permission to actually try it in a patient. And in February 1991, they got approval to do it, and the Professor Lindstedt tried it in a patient with HT1. And you won't be able to read it, but that is the very brief note that the scientists in ICI received from Professor Lindstedt, just saying, it seems it works like a dream. And that's how that particular orphan drug was born. To say that it transformed the lives of patients with HT1 would be something of an understatement. Most patients with HT1 did not not live beyond their 5th birthday, depending on the severity of the disease. Today, there are patients alive who are raising their own families. And ironically, we now have to report pregnancy as an adverse event. It is a very valuable adverse event to report because, of course, that's the only way we can learn and the only way we can capture information. But it's a great story. However, the story didn't get complete there. We got the orphan drug designation in the US and it was followed in Europe. But the pathway itself was really very interesting, and other scientists looked at the pathway that had been described for NTBC and thought that it may have a therapeutic use in AKU. There was, in early 2000s, a very empowered, passionate patient. I know Nick will vouch for this guy who sadly passed away last year, Robert. He was the pioneer and the driving force behind the research that went into AKU. He actually approached our then CEO of Swedish Orphan International, Bo Jesper. Bo was so taken with what Robert was trying to do that he gave seed funding to the AKU Society to help form that organisation. Robert was very passionate and got a lot of scientific work done. And to cut a very long story short, there was a very important trial carried out in the US by Professor Gall and Wendy Intro, which reported in 2009 that sadly, that trial had failed completely. And it would have been very easy for the AKU Society to give up at that stage. There had been lots of fundraising efforts going on to do basic research, and there was a passion to see this going forward. And then we took a fairly pivotal telephone call from Nick. Nick phoned me up and said, will you take a meeting? And I said, yeah, always happy to talk. I obviously knew about AKU. Everybody in the company knew about AKU. We were all devastated when the trial didn't work. So Nick came along, and my partner in crime, Karen Lesh, was sitting on the 3rd row, and I took a meeting, and we said, there are things we can do, and there are things we can't do. What we can do is offer you help, advice, support. What we can't do necessarily is we can't be overt about this because it's an unlicensed indication, but we can work in the background, facilitate support and advise. And what we actually did at that stage is we looked at the stakeholders who we had to engage with to enable us to move forward and make incremental steps forward. And this, don't go too fast, Bruce. This was fundamentally the stakeholders we identified at that time, who we needed to engage with, who we needed to influence, and the work streams that we needed to do. Some of this, as you can see in one box, is about SOBI. A lot of it is outside of that influence. But I think the most important point is that the patients in the AKU Society was at the centre of that universe. And Nick very much took on board the work and the responsibility of making things happen in a lot of those other boxes, with help and guidance where we could. We obviously had the product, we had to inspire and give the same passion about this project to our international colleagues. I think Camish would be the first to agree, we sometimes struggle with that, but we persuaded them that this was something that was worthwhile. And we made incremental steps forward. Nick managed to find KOLs and advocates to do a financial model, so vital in terms of health economics and getting the financial wherewithal to get something to happen. We started engaging with the now defunct Agnes group. And one of the things we really did was to facilitate a meeting. And this was a meeting that was co-sponsored by the AKU Society and by the company, where we pulled together clinicians, payers, regulators, in one place to hear the story and to hear what we were trying to achieve together. And that was a pivotal meeting in many respects, because from that point on, we seem to have the agreement of all these important stakeholders to make things happen. So, this is what we are working with in the modern world. So this is a slide I've stolen from one of my colleagues internationally, but we all recognise that the patient journey is so important. But the classic model doesn't necessarily work with an orphan, unlicensed medication. So you have to be able to populate this model and fill in the boxes. And that's why the stakeholder management is so important. You need to be able to produce a value dossier. You need to be able to satisfy the regulators. This model is evolving and changing all the time. And what we do to get a rare disease into mainstream use has to move with the times. So we have to continually evolve the stakeholder management. This slide thing is very slow. So, where are we now? I'm very conscious you haven't shown me a sign yet, but I'm sure I'm getting close to the end of my time. So where are we now? Almost unheard of, we now have a centre of excellence set up in Liverpool. When that was set up, 50 patients were funded by the government. It's an unlicensed indication. We have persuaded, Nick has persuaded the authorities that this is a real worthwhile investment. We've secured, as a consortium, FP7 funding. The SONIA 1 study has been completed, that's the dose ranging study. SONIA 2 has finished recruiting. It will run for another 4 years because that's the complexity of the design. But at the end of this, we hope to have definitive evidence that will give rise to a license for this product so that every patient across the world can have access to it. The story continues. But I do want to quickly get onto these couple of slides because I think it's really, really important if the slides will ever move forward. Am I pointing it? It doesn't. This is just from the AKU website. This is Simon's story. He said, he didn't know he couldn't find any information. It was only because he was passionate and he wanted to find out more information that he was able to do that. But I also want to just have this slide here. I'll skip that one. You can see that one later. I talk about the virtuous circle. This is so important to me. The hero is the patient at the centre of the circle. The pharma companies, the patient organisations, the payers and the physicians are the people who make it happen. But if we really want to put rare diseases and advance rare disease research and collaboration, we have to have the same agenda. You have to have stakeholder management. And the final slide is a quote from Nick himself. He doesn't actually remember making this quote, and he says it's the first time he's been quoted, and I really, really struggle to believe that. But developing and maintaining a network of key stakeholders who are committed to the same objective is really the clue to driving this forward. If you can get the patient and the patient organisation at the centre of what you do, and then get every other major stakeholder to agree to your driving vision, then you can move heaven and earth. And Nick's managed to do that. So it's been a pleasure telling you the AKU story and the story of Mrs. Thank you.